Imagine growing up in one of the oldest palaces on Earth, surrounded by servants who poured your tea and drove your car, only to walk away from all of it for a man with an ordinary government job. That is exactly what one Japanese princess did nearly 2 decades ago, and today we're going to look at where her choice took her, what she gave up, and whether she ever looked back. Stick around, because the ending of this story might surprise you. To understand how remarkable her decision was, you first have to understand the world she came from. The Japanese Imperial Family is widely considered the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy on the planet, with a lineage that traditionalists trace back more than 2,000 years. For centuries, the emperor was regarded not merely as a political ruler, but as a living link to the divine, believed to descend from the sun goddess Amaterasu. That belief was formally renounced after Japan's defeat in the Second World War, when the emperor at the time was compelled to declare that he was not, in fact, a god. From that point on, the imperial family became a symbol of the nation rather than a governing power, bound by a constitution that stripped them of any political authority. Within that rarefied world, tradition still dictated almost everything, especially who a royal could marry. For most of the 20th century, it was assumed that princes and princesses would marry within aristocratic circles. That assumption cracked when Crown Prince Akihito, who would later become emperor, fell for a young woman named Michiko Shota, whom he'd met on a tennis court. Michiko came from a wealthy business family, but she was not aristocratic blood, and that was enough to provoke fierce resistance from traditionalists inside the palace, reportedly including Akihito's own mother. Despite the friction, the couple married in 1959, and their union became the first time in the modern era that a commoner had married directly into the imperial line. It set a precedent that would echo through the next generation in ways no one could have predicted. Akihito and Michiko had 3 children. Their 2 sons, Naruhito and Fumihito, were destined for lives shaped by succession and duty. Their daughter, born on April 18, 1969, was given the name Sayako and the formal title Princess Nori. As a girl who could never inherit the throne under Japan's male-only succession rules, her path was always going to look different from her brothers. She was raised with the understanding that one day, marriage would likely mean stepping outside the imperial family altogether. Sayako's early years were, by any measure, extraordinarily comfortable. She attended Gakushuin, the elite private school long associated with Japan's imperial and aristocratic families, moving through its kindergarten, elementary, and secondary divisions before enrolling at Gakushuin University to study Japanese language and literature. She grew up inside the walls of the Togu Palace, the residence of the crown prince and princess, cared for by household staff who handled everything from her meals to her transportation. She rarely, if ever, went anywhere without a driver. But even a life of comfort can come with its own kind of confinement. Those close to the family have noted that Sayako sometimes felt boxed in by the sheer weight of protocol that came with her position, the expectations, the security, the sense of always being watched. Her easygoing nature reportedly earned her an affectionate nickname from her father, who is said to have called her something like the girl who doesn't fret, a nod to her calm, unbothered temperament even in the face of a highly scripted existence. Even before adulthood, Sayako's life bore the fingerprints of imperial ritual. As a young girl, she reportedly spent stretches of time traveling with just her mother, away from the rest of the family, and later took up traditional Japanese classical dance during her school years, eventually performing publicly at Tokyo's National Theater. Those closest to her have described her as an unusually gentle and easygoing child, someone who arrived into the world a little earlier than expected, and who seemed content with whatever came her way. That temperament would serve her well decades later, when her entire world was about to be upended by choice rather than circumstance. She graduated from university in 1992, the same year her grandfather, Emperor Hirohito, had died a few years earlier, ushering her own father onto the throne as emperor. Rather than settling into a purely ceremonial life, Sayako pursued something that genuinely interested her: birds. She became a part-time researcher and later a full-time one at the Yamashina Institute for Ornithology, reportedly becoming the first Japanese princess to earn her own salary. Her specialty was the common kingfisher, and she spent years studying bird populations around the imperial grounds, even contributing to published research on the subject. Alongside her scientific work, she carried out royal duties, representing the imperial family on trips to more than a dozen countries, sometimes traveling entirely on her own. She supported programs training guide dogs for the visually impaired and served as a steady, trusted presence for her parents during public engagements. By all accounts, She watched her mother and father's marriage closely, and it left a mark on her. Their relationship, forged across a divide that many thought impossible to cross, taught her that love could outweigh birthright. She reportedly resolved early on that when the time came, she would marry for love and nothing less, even if it meant breaking with the arranged marriage customs still expected of imperial women. The person who would eventually change the course of her life had actually crossed her path years earlier, during her university days. His name was Sayako Kuroda, an urban designer working for the Tokyo metropolitan government. It wasn't until 2003, at a gathering hosted by her brother Fumihito, that the two reconnected as adults. Kuroda and Fumihito had been schoolmates since childhood at Gakushuin, and Kuroda had visited the imperial grounds many times over the years in that capacity. Sayako remembered him as a tall, serious-looking friend of her brother's, hardly the kind of first impression that suggests a fairy tale romance, but one that clearly grew into something deeper. Kuroda's own career path is worth noting. He had reportedly turned down an opportunity at a major private company in favor of public sector work, partly because it let him stay in Tokyo with his widowed mother rather than relocate. His day-to-day work involved urban planning and construction projects for the city. There was nothing flashy about him, no inherited fortune, no noble lineage, just a steady, hard-working career civil servant. And yet it was precisely that ordinariness that seemed to draw Sayako in. According to her own later remarks, the two started out as nothing more than friendly acquaintances, with romantic feelings only slowly taking root as they spent more time together, aided in part by her brother, who reportedly let the couple use his residence as a low-key meeting spot. Their engagement was announced in December 2004, when Sayako was 35 and Kuroda was 39. At the press conference that followed, Sayako made a point of asking the media to go easy on her husband-to-be, aware of the intense scrutiny that would follow an emperor's daughter marrying outside the aristocracy. She described the moment she reconnected with him warmly, saying that his presence had stayed with her, and that conversation between them had flowed naturally from there. Kuroda, for his part, recalled proposing to her over tea at her brother's residence. Sayako later admitted that she had always known, since she was very young, that marriage would eventually mean leaving the imperial family altogether. So while she felt some nervousness about the unknowns ahead, none of it came as a real shock to her. Remarkably, no one within the palace seems to have objected to the match itself. The real condition was structural, not personal. Japanese law requires that female members of the imperial family who marry commoners give up their titles, their official status, and their place within the family entirely. For Sayako, that trade-off wasn't a difficult one. She reportedly welcomed the chance to build a life outside the rigid formality of the palace. Sayako, then 35, and Kuroda, 39, were married on November 15, 2005 at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. Notably, the first time an imperial family wedding had been held at a private hotel rather than within palace grounds. She chose a simple white Western-style gown and a single strand of pearls rather than the elaborate 12-layered ceremonial kimono some imperial brides had worn in the past. Kuroda wore a standard morning suit. Her parents and other family members attended what was, by royal standards, a fairly modest and understated ceremony. Roughly 30 people at the rite itself, and around 120 guests at the reception, where the governor of Tokyo offered a toast. Still, thousands of well-wishers lined the streets between the palace and the hotel to catch a glimpse of her on the way to becoming, officially, Mrs. Kuroda. The wedding day itself followed a carefully choreographed schedule, beginning early in the morning when the groom arrived to collect his bride, followed by their arrival at the hotel in an official imperial vehicle, the formal marriage registration, a press conference where Sayako wore a kimono borrowed from her mother, and finally a reception in the evening. In an unusual departure from tradition, the reception featured a French-inspired menu rather than typical Japanese wedding fare, and the newlyweds broke with custom by leaving the ceremonial stage early to sit among their guests at shared table. Crown Princess Masako, her sister-in-law, was there to see her off as well, having herself made the opposite journey years earlier, arriving into the imperial family from ordinary life, a transition she reportedly found so stressful that she stepped back from public duties for well over a year afterward. In some ways, the two women's stories mirrored each other from opposite directions, one crossing into royalty, the other crossing back out of it. The moment carried real historical weight. She became only the sixth woman born into the imperial family to marry a commoner since Japan's post-war imperial household law took effect in 1947, and the first to lose her royal status in over 2 decades. As compensation for giving up her royal allowance for life, she reportedly received a one-time payment from a state, said to be worth over $1 million, intended to help her transition into private life. And transition she did, in ways that sound almost unbelievable for someone raised the way she was. She had to learn to drive. She practiced grocery shopping and using a bank card, tasks she had genuinely never needed to do herself. She took on the ordinary chores of running a household, cooking, cleaning, laundry, without the staff who had handled all of it for her entire life. Her security detail shifted from the elite Imperial Guard to the regular Tokyo Metropolitan Police, and even that presence became lighter as time went on. The couple initially rented an apartment before eventually purchasing a condominium, which she is said to have helped pay for using a portion of the money she'd received upon leaving the Imperial family. By her own account, and by the accounts of those around her, the adjustment wasn't effortless. She reportedly leaned on a story her mother had once told her about a snail who resented the weight of the shell on its back until it noticed every other snail was carrying one too, a reminder that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has their own burdens to bear. It seems to have helped her find her footing in a life that looked nothing like the one she'd grown up in. Losing her title didn't mean losing her family. In the years since, Sayako and her husband have continued to appear at major imperial functions, receptions for visiting dignitaries, formal state occasions, and milestone family events. They were present, for instance, at the 2019 enthronement ceremony of her brother Naruhito as emperor. She's also remained close with the next generation of the family. When her niece, Princess Aiko, celebrated her coming-of-age ceremony in December 2021, she wore a tiara that had originally been made for Sayako back in 1989, when she herself turned 20. Under a more recent tradition, imperial princesses receive custom tiaras funded by the state when they come of age, but those tiaras must be returned if the princess later marries a commoner and exits the family, just as happened with Sayako's niece Meiko years later. Sayako's own tiara was an exception, though it had been paid for privately by her parents rather than by state funds, so she was allowed to keep it, and it was that same tiara Aiko later borrowed, since a new one wasn't commissioned for her out of sensitivity to the hardships of the COVID-19 pandemic. At that same 2021 ceremony, Sayako and her husband stood out for how unassuming they remained among the more formally dressed attendees. He reportedly drove them to the palace in an ordinary car, with her simply riding in the passenger seat beside him, a striking image next to the pomp surrounding everyone else. The next major turn in her story came in 2012, when she was appointed a priestess at the ISC Grand Shrine, one of the most sacred sites in Shinto tradition, dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu, and historically tied to the imperial lineage. She initially assisted her aunt, who held the senior post of chief priestess, gradually taking on more responsibility over the following years. In 2017, when her aunt retired, Sayako was elevated to the role of supreme priestess, a position that now has her spending weeks at a time away from Tokyo, based near the shrine to carry out ceremonial duties on behalf of the imperial family. Her husband's career, meanwhile, continued to progress steadily within the Tokyo metropolitan government. He was promoted in 2021 from section head role in urban planning to a more senior general management position, a step up that came with a better salary than the roughly 10 million yen typical of section head roles in that department. Around this same period, the couple also finished paying off the mortgage on their home after 15 years, a distinctly ordinary milestone for a woman who was once an emperor's daughter. The couple never had children, but Sayako has remained an active and affectionate presence in the lives of her nieces and nephews, and by most accounts, she and her husband have built a quiet, steady partnership over their years together. Now in her mid-50s, with her husband a few years older, she appears to have settled into a life defined less by titles and privilege and more by purpose. Her religious duties at ISC, her relationships with family, and the simple rhythms of a private life she once had to learn from scratch. Looking back at everything Sayako gave up, the palace, the staff, the title, the guaranteed comfort, it would be easy to assume she made a sacrifice she might one day regret. But nothing in her story suggests regret. Instead, it reads as a deliberate choice, made with open eyes by someone who watched her own parents defy convention for love and decided she wanted the same thing for herself. It raises a question worth sitting with. If you were in her position, born into unimaginable privilege but bound by rules dictating who you could marry and how you had to live, would you trade it all for an ordinary life with someone you loved? Sayako answered that question nearly 2 decades ago, and everything since then suggests she'd make the same choice again. What do you think? Would you choose a life of luxury and status, or one of love and simplicity? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.